safety.
Thanks everyone. Look, we've got a fantastic panel here. I'm not sure if it's going to be sort of as lively as the China panel just before lunch, but let's hope so. Look, all of our panellists have very different interests in Asia. They'll be coming at this from a different perspective, but they all know Asia very well. So, you know, it's great to have everyone here. And look, Penny Wong said this morning, you know, she was sort of saying she didn't really understand why Australian companies were wary about investing in Asia, and that's why she got sort of Nicholas Moore in to try and sort that out. She said she didn't feel the dial was moving particularly fast, particularly in Southeast Asia. Our other speakers said, you know, we're pretty good at trade with Asia, but not in investing. So, you know, I want to ask each of our panellists, you know, what is going wrong here? Why are we underweight in Asia? I know Vicky might not agree with that, but we'll get back to that. But I might start with you, Peter, with your very important role. I mean, you lead Australia's sort of global investment network in 61 countries. And, you know, you've told me we're doing okay in North Asia, but Southeast Asia, we're punching below our weight. What's going on there?
Well, I guess it's been a challenge. It's been a challenge for not just years, but decades, if you pull it apart. And just, I guess, to touch on the data, and the Foreign Minister made a couple of comments, but one would be to say that Australia's stock of outward investment, Southeast Asia accounts for about 3.4% of that. But if you look at global flows of capital into Southeast Asia, it's running at about 7%. So Australia's doing about half of what the rest of the world is. And that's not all China. If you look at it from the OECD, it's grown very strongly. So either in Australia, we're not seeing the same opportunity set, or we're not able to take advantage of it for some reason, or we see better opportunities somewhere else. And if you look at it closely, then you can see that our track record of investing in Asia has been mixed. As you said, Northeast Asia, we've done very well, and strong relationships will need to continue. If you look at it in Southeast Asia, it's been a checkered history to some extent. So there have been some investments that haven't gone well, but there's also been some very successful ones where companies have gone in, built great businesses, but then they've pulled out. They've actually pulled the capital out to then invest in the next thing, which hasn't been in Southeast Asia. To ask the question of why we're not doing more, I think there's a couple of elements. I think if you look at the region, and you can talk about the region, but the reality is very different countries, different points of economic development, different opportunity sets, and so you really need to be willing to invest in understanding the individual opportunities in individual markets. And it's only by doing that that you'll be successful. I'm always mindful on investment that investment is always discretionary capital. To put capital at risk in another country is different from trade. To put capital at risk in another country requires that long-term perspective. And it often involves being there. And I'll just say one final thing and then I'll stop. But someone remarked to me last week, our greatest challenge with Asia is that we're too close for our own good. And what that means is that the risk is there can be an illusion of sensing that we understand it, or that we can take advantage of the opportunity by being here. And when you look at the success, and some people point to the Canadians or some of the European countries, one of the key drivers of their success is to make the call, to put boots in the ground and take a long-term perspective. And then you start to understand it better, you start to see better deal flow as well.
Okay. I'll go to Amanda. We're talking about boots on the ground. Linus certainly has boots on the ground in Malaysia. We're going to talk about Asian literacy later, which I know you want to talk about. But can you tell us your story when you were weighing up the risks of going into Malaysia? You know, why did you do it? What were some of the sort of key challenges?
So we even have some pink boots on the ground in Malaysia that just happen to fit my feet very nicely. I cannot tell you about when Linus decided to go into Malaysia because it predated me. So when I arrived, we already had $1 billion on the ground in Kuantan in Malaysia, in a plant that actually didn't work. And, our task has been how to make that asset work. And we've done that, I think, really very successfully. And so if we were to look at it as a case study of really being successful in an Asian environment, I would say that the key rules that we've got is you cannot be there as a visitor. Right? So our plant is not managed by a bunch of expats with the locals there to do the dirty work, right? Our plant is 98% Malaysians. We have worked very hard to make sure that we have a balance of Malays and Chinese, Malay Malaysians, Chinese Malaysians and Indian Malaysians within our organisation, because that gives us that diversity. We've gone from having about 35 women on staff when I joined the company now to 212. And we really have looked to engage and to take advantage of the skills that our people have brought to the company, as well as our ability to provide improved skills for our people. But anyone who thinks that you can go in and you can manage your local relationships by appointing a PR agency, I'm telling you guys, you're destined to fail. Don't bother. Just go down to the pub at Rose Bay. It's very rewarding when you get it right. And, we love being in Malaysia, and our Malaysian people have skills that nobody else in the world has outside of China. And I guess the ultimate measure on this is that we've just built a new processing facility in Kalgoorlie, and just over 30% of the staff who are managing the ramp up of that facility, including the general manager, are Malaysians. And so I think as we come right back to sort of the starting point, too often in Australia we talk about what can we do to Asia rather than what is the mutual benefit of us working together. And the second thing is that actually, here's a real scoop, not all Asian countries are the same. And so actually recognising your local environment is critically important. And I can tell you that certainly those which are ex-Commonwealth countries like Malaysia tend to be a little bit more comfortable for Australians because we recognise the same laws, the same political processes, and if we're looking for maybe a gentler entry, I mean, entering via an ex-Commonwealth country is certainly, I think, a lot easier than one where the legal systems are fundamentally different.
Yeah, some great comments there. I'll come back to. I went to your plant about
You did?
5 years ago, and
Or
everyone
longer.
was Malaysian.
Yeah, Well, not me. Although
Except
now
for you.
Messiah Amanda.
Yes. Vicky, I'll come to you. I mean, you're coming at this from a different, because you will probably argue we have in fact been punching above our weight in your sector, attracting foreign students to Australia.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think we're one of the great success stories in terms of our engagement into the region broadly. And, if you look at over the last couple of decades, we've grown our international education and research collaboration with the region. I think that's important. And taking it beyond a transactional relationship of just educating, putting bums on seats in Australian universities. I think it has definitely gone deeper than that with bricks and mortar in different countries, etc. I think if I was sitting here next year, I would be on the negative side because we've got some pretty blunt federal government policy at the moment. And I was interested to hear this, the Foreign Minister today say that, well, we're still going to have lots of students. I just don't think that's true. The numbers would show right now, even if I look at the data for visa applications June to July, there's been a 35% drop and we haven't got the policy in place yet. So we're certainly punching above our weight right now at the moment. And it's so important for all the reasons that there's not been a panel here today, I think, where innovation, technology, research, education hasn't been mentioned. So somewhere, you know, it underpins so much of what we do. So certainly punching above our weight, $48 billion industry, you know, top 5, you know, the 4th largest export sector, largest services export sector, responsible for half of our economic growth last year. I mean, the numbers are there. So you start playing around with that, it's a pretty negative impact. I'm sure we'll talk about that because we're starting to see that.
Yep. The current government's policies aside, are you also concerned about what a coalition government's policies might look like if they win the next election?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a race to the bottom on the migration front. And what has started off, I mean, let's be really honest about what we are talking about here. It is a migration issue. It's not an education issue. It's not a housing crisis issue. It's not a rental affordability issue. And in fact, I think I saw today one of the ministers has said, no, it's not about housing. This is about both sides of our political parties really looking to appease, I guess, an electorate which for some reason thinks that migration is bad. I'm not sitting here saying we should have open slather, and I think that's an important point. And I think there is a genuine discussion to be had about what Australia's international education sector looks like, the diversity. I mean, you know, our eggs are in the China basket, particularly the group of universities that I represent, for a whole lot of reasons. So there is definitely room for that discussion, but wrapping it up in a migration debate, I think we do at our own peril. It's a self-sabotage.
Was that a mistake having all our eggs in that basket?
I don't think it was a mistake. I think, you know, we're a demand-driven system. We have a quality product. Most of the people sitting on this panel and in this room have a significant exposure to China for all the good reasons that we know. That said, there's no reason why we shouldn't be diversifying, and that's easier said than done. And it's something that universities are my universities at least, are you know, very attuned to in terms of how we do that.
Right, yeah. Chris, can we talk about your views on this? And you're well versed with that. You were speaking a bit of Indonesian to me when we were on the phone the other week.
You know,
and I think you were up in Japan recently. What
Yes.
are you finding? What are the challenges there for you?
It's interesting, and just listening to both Amanda and Vicky, in Australia we have this habit of tearing down every success story. So we sort of end up in this situation where we're strong, we're unreliable, and where we're, I guess, reliable, we're not strong. And you know, if I think about in the resources side, we all love to tear shreds off the mining sector, who are wildly responsible for the wonderful living standards we enjoy in this country. Our North Asian friends now are deeply concerned about whether they can rely on Australia for energy security, which is a wonderful thought, because where will they get it if not from us? Is there somewhere across the straits from North Asia that they might be thinking about? Hello, Mr. Vladimir. So that makes no sense. And then we have our education system. Now, look, I think the housing, you know, maybe I have a slight shade of difference with what Vicky was saying. I do think the housing crisis is in large part contributing to the concerns about migration. But again, you know, it's for our governments to provide reliable, stable ramps, so we're not suddenly having these peaks and troughs. And honestly, the supply side problem we've had in our housing market is no secret to anyone. It's been around for 2 or 3 decades. So what do our customers want if we think of them like that? You know, if we're going to invest, we think of it as a business relationship. All of these individual Asian countries, to pick up Peter and Amanda's points, they're our customers. Put yourself in their place. Can we be a reliable partner for them? Now, I don't want to sound too negative, because in many ways there's wonderful success stories all through the Australian and Asian history, in, you know, North Asia, Southeast Asia, India and China. But there are these pockets of difficulty, and it comes back to that to me. The only other thought I have is that really deeply engaging, particularly in a complex set of jurisdictions like Southeast Asia, it takes a spirit of entrepreneurialism. And do we feel like in Australia we're nailing that now? It feels to me like every time we see a problem, we see a regulatory framework and an ombudsman and a complaints panel. Is that the way we want to run? Because if that's the way we want to run, fair enough, but we won't be anywhere in Asia.
Well, that sort of takes me to the next question, which you've all got views on, is Asia literacy, and also the need for Australian companies to kind of give back as well. I mean, we tend to, I mean, when I lived in China, we were great at sort of barging in and selling people lots of stuff, but not really contributing in, you know, in any sort of further way. I mean, I might start again with Amanda. You have many views on Asia literacy. What are we doing wrong in terms of not understanding our neighbours well? And
Yeah. So I think first of all, I'd pick up what you said, Chris. Risk appetite in Australia seems to have headed off in I don't know, somewhere overseas, and we've lost a lot of that. And moving to another country is, by definition, going to have some risk associated with it. And we have quite an insular view. I remember when I moved to Malaysia in 2014, within particularly the investment and analyst community, you know, sort of, it was almost like this was a hardship posting. I'm going to tell you, it was not hard, other than the fact they make lousy bread, right? And I tried to convince my husband unsuccessfully to learn how to bake bread, but he did not do it. But, sorry, back to, you know, I think that it is really important, and that we understand, you know, one of the terms which is often quite fashionable when we're talking about diversity and gender diversity in Australia is unconscious bias. And once you recognise it, you can check it at the door. I think, and this is because we're such a nice panel, this morning was very lively, I am going to try to say something somewhat controversial.
Please do.
Which is quite often we as Australians don't recognise our unconscious bias with respect to other cultures. And so it is not a case of us going in and being able to teach, right? There is a mutuality which is really important. And in fact, when I first took over Linus and went to Malaysia, despite the fact that we were replete with challenges, I set aside a full day. And in fact, the teams were fabulous. They made me eat durian and jackfruit, which, but also the women put on a fashion parade with all their various native garments and things like that. And it gave me a true understanding, rather than reading a guidebook to say, this is how you should address so-and-so and this is how you should address so-and-so. And there's a mutuality in that exchange, which I think is incredibly important. And I think that it is the same no matter where you are. We have a strong partnership with Japan in particular. We operate with toll manufacturers in Vietnam, and truly recognising and truly believing what we Australians think we believe about being egalitarian and outward looking is something that we should always ask of ourselves as we interact globally.
Yeah. But Peter, do you have a view on that? Do we have this sort of unconscious bias? And I know, I mean, Amanda's also talked to me about sort of the role of some Australian diplomats on the ground are great at this, others aren't. I mean, what's your view on that?
I think Amanda makes a great point. I've got no doubt there's unconscious bias, no doubt whatsoever. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that we've got great pockets of deep expertise, and there's some great success stories of engagement as well. I think, just to talk about the education sector for a minute, the way that the education sector is engaged in the region has been phenomenal, and I think it is absolutely a success story. And when you look at trade and investment deals, often the alumni are at the heart of those deals. The diaspora is at the heart of the deals. And so there's that commercial benefit as well as obviously the broader social benefit. So I think we've got some great advantage there, which has been building for many years. There are actually great success stories of companies growing and expanding, frankly, many private companies and they don't publicise it in the same way. And so I think, of course, we can do better. And of course, the nuanced understanding of individual markets is critical, but we've actually got deep expertise. And so I guess a call out would be, if you're thinking about it, but you don't have that expertise within your own organisation, you will be able to find someone that does, and government will be able to help to connect you with that as well. So I think there are some positives we should focus on at the same time.
Yeah. Vicky, you're nodding.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking about the positives because it's easy to go straight to the negatives. If we look at, our students are our greatest source of developing Asian literacy, and to just hark back to a couple of comments that we had earlier about sort of flipping the way we look at ourselves in the region, it's as important for us to have our students into the region as well as us taking students from the region. And a great flagship policy has been the new Colombo Plan policy of the government, which I was intimately engaged with when Julie Bishop started that, and it has continued to this day. And I just think that's such an important policy in terms of getting our Australian students into the region. I also find it really interesting, we talk about Asia literacy, but it's not one size fits all, as we know. So, Asia literacy is different to China literacy, Indonesian literacy, India literacy. So there's a lot of nuances there. And of course, we have this fantastic alumni of students that we have taught in this country or offshore as well, who are now in the region. So it's actually about leveraging their expertise, to your point, Peter. I mean, they're now senior people in government and they're going about their business in the region. So I think there's a good story to tell, but there's a missing piece somewhere in terms of developing that Asian literacy. And I don't disagree with the unconscious bias that I think is inherent in all of us, if we're actually honest, in terms of how we operate.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, you've done some work on this as well. I mean, you had quite a bad experience. You invested quite a lot in this professional placement scholarship program in China to bring people out here and make them literate about Australia. It sort of didn't go anywhere. So it's
no, well, I mean, China then entered a different phase of its development. So, actually, the financial services sector is a great case study. And I'll probably sound like I'm banging the drum here a little bit excessively, but think about our banking system, which is enormous but entirely Australian focused. We all know ANZ had an Asian strategy which it ran for many years and then just found it couldn't really make work, so it pulled back from that. Our super funds, $3.5 trillion in assets under management, still really haven't found a way to move the needle in terms of investing into Southeast Asia. So back to the point Peter was making at the start, why is it that we in Australia seem uniquely unable to capture this opportunity? Do we like the sense of a young, dynamic, fast-growing, incredibly engaging and interesting region? Do we like the idea of investing in that? It's in our time zone, particularly for folks who live in the northern states. It's only a few hours away. It should be an easy hit. And yet, our massive financial services sector just can't get its head around how to engage.
So someone else said that to me earlier. The super funds could be the key here. Why aren't they investing more?
Well, the super funds, the banks, we've got a huge asset management industry. Again, where we're strong, we're not reliable. And where we're reliable, we're not strong. So it's an enormous strength of Australia there. We haven't found a way to deploy it. I go back to risk appetite. We look at it and say it's too complex, untangling all the individual, unique jurisdictional issues. There are there are barriers as an organisation that's done some significant business there in Asia. There are some barriers in local regulation around capital controls, in currency flows in and out of the country, etc., that do make it a little bit more difficult. But gee, if we made that a priority from our governments, that would be interesting. But I still come back to that mindset. Do we really want it? Because, I mean, hey, there's 1 billion people in Southeast Asia who all really want it. So we've got to really want it too.
Okay.
But we've been talking about this for
decades.
Yep. I've been around the university sector for 23 years. And we're still talking about this.
Do you feel like we've got more risk averse or less risk averse?
Well, I think our universities have become less risk averse.
I think everyone has.
we've got bricks and mortar in Indonesia, and Monash is there. We've got RMIT, which is not one of my universities, but long-standing relationship and bricks and mortar in Vietnam, Singapore, Hong, etc. Is it? So I'm taking over.
No,
sorry,
go
former
for it.
journalist in
No.
me couldn't help myself, but I get a little frustrated because we continually have this conversation and this dialogue, and yet, what is the barrier? Are we fair weather friends? We go in, it doesn't work, we come out. Is it the policy environment? For us, for the international education sector, we're on the edge of the cliff at the moment, as far as we can see, and where this will go. Our reputational damage is going to be incredible. We've seen in Canada a 32% drop in visa applications. So we've got the playbook. Yep. So we've invested over decades in building up an industry in the region, and it could all just go. So is it government policy? It's a rhetorical question because I'm not sure we know the answer.
Yeah.
I felt
But
like you were directing that at me.
No, I was just
Well,
pointing at you.
I was going to say,
Sorry, Michael, but
glad you asked.
No, I like a bit of
resume
interjection.
normal transmission. Sorry.
No, well, that was
Maybe I can come
Go
out
for
from a slightly different perspective. I really feel for the education sector, but are we actually competent to do this, Australians? Are we setting ourselves an aspiration here and it is actually not in our competency toolkit? When we think about what are we really good at in Australia, right? And we are absolute world leaders and we continue to invest in it. So we're absolute lead in terms of mining, technology, mining safety, mining sustainably. But you know what? You can't export geology. If you mine like our ore body is in Mount Weld, right, that is where that work is going to be done. We're also world leaders in agriculture, most efficient, most capable, right? But that's growing our food and fibre here in Australia. We are excellent in terms of the education sector, and we have a differentiated product offering, which is a poor dumb, capitalist, I think is a great thing to have. But you know what we're really crap at? Sorry, what we're not so competent at is actually manufacturing, right? What is it that we are most likely to want to do in terms of, sort of taking a position in Asia is actually about manufacturing industry. Yep. And so once again, I come back to our experience on this. So a lot of our people who work in our plant in Malaysia came out of the oil and gas sector. I mean, we have some amazing both mechanical and process engineers who work in our team, who I would hazard an opinion are more competent in a complex chemical manufacturing environment than many in Australia. So have we worked out what we want to be famous for? And have we then worked out how to do that in another environment other than Australia?
So that leads to my next question. I mean, what does the government need to do here? Obviously at home they could lower costs, but where do we start here? Maybe I'll start with you, Pete.
I might make a couple of comments if I can.
Yeah.
Just super quickly. I think, Amanda, that's a great point about what's the shape of our economy, so where's the core competency that we can take? And if you look at Southeast Asia, and for example, think about transport and logistics, where Australia's actually got some great players. I guess I'm calling out Linfox, that has a really good footprint and productive business. So across services as well, we've got some great capability where we're doing really well in Asia. So I think that's an important point about what should be realistic. You mentioned the superannuation funds, and there's a number of issues there. You look at the way they're regulated or the way their performance is managed, which then dictates how their portfolios are constructed, and it means by definition there's not a Southeast Asia bucket. So they'll have global exposure, and frankly they're agnostic about where that marginal dollar goes. So there needs to be the opportunity set, and it needs to be structured in a way that's digestible for them, and then the risk return and also the return on effort needs to be compelling so that they'll put those investments there. In terms of what government can do, I guess it goes to some of the things that the Foreign Minister mentioned this morning, in that Nicholas Moore in producing his report was really challenged with coming forward with practical recommendations. And so I guess just to highlight some that have been actioned, the investment deal teams is about putting investment professionals into market that can do essentially two things. They can help identify specific transactions. They can work with local authorities in market around the structuring of those. And then that gives us the ability to promote those opportunities here in Australia. EFA is a key part of that, and this is the first time that the EFA has had staff in market, as an example. Or you look at the Southeast Asia Business Exchange, which is really focused on the trade piece. You look at initiatives around the alumni, and you look at the work that's being taken through the 10 business champions, which is a great resource, and I want to call them out. And so whether it's Shane Elliott from ANZ, whether it's Louise Adams, who's on a panel shortly, whether it's Jennifer Westacott, that engagement is super helpful in terms of building the awareness and the activity here on shore of building the awareness.
Chris, do you think, things are happening, but we've tried this in the past. Are we really getting anywhere? And I think we've spoken before about, there's been missed opportunities, particularly the situation with nickel production in Indonesia.
And that's probably, that's an interesting case study, because Indonesia partnered with China there to the challenge from Amanda, which is a good one to think about. What are we good at? Why do we feel like we belong there? What can we compete in? Could we have been in that contest, maybe, Amanda? I would ask that question to you.
Well, I don't know much about nickel, but I would expect we should have been able to be, yes.
Yeah. So it just feels like, cyber risk. We've got some real strengths here, in the services sector. There's so many individual parts, but that's what our economy is. We shouldn't be trying to invent a new industry and say, hey, here's our Southeast Asian industry. Start where our strengths are and project outwards from there. And we have lots of strengths. We're good at beating ourselves up, and maybe we're all doing a little bit of that today, but we do have lots of great strengths. And the services sector, I think your original question was, what can the government do? The first thing is regulatory stability. Imagine you had Vicky's job right now.
Yeah.
It's so difficult. It's a controversial one, but we could be an energy superpower. We absolutely could. The Northeast Asians, everyone's committed to the transition. Some countries see a bigger path through gas, for example, LNG, than what we do. That's fine. If that's part of their pathway, we can be part of the solution if we want to be. So there's lots and lots of opportunities. Regulatory consistency, but we've got to have the ticker.
And are we? Because we're also talking about Asian inbound investment too.
Yes.
Have we failed here in some respects, particularly, obviously the concern in Japan and Korea about gas development?
It's extraordinary. You look at our inbound. It's the US, the UK, and the EU ex-UK, who are our three biggest and always have been. And why is that? Well, it's probably because we're sluggish and low growth, low productivity versus what they're seeing in their local markets. That's probably the reality there. They see more dynamic uses for their capital in their local jurisdictions. And again, that's a challenge to us on productivity, which has been languishing for a couple of decades. Can we do better there?
Yeah. Vicky, I feel like I'm leaving you out here. Do you have any views on this?
No, I don't feel left out at all. It's very interesting. On what in particular, Michael?
Just on this idea, we've talked about the student cap, so we won't go over that again, but in terms of what can the government be doing to encourage investment both in and out?
It's pretty fundamental. And there are some good, respectfully, I know Peter will, because of his role, you have to present the picture, and it's a good positive picture in terms of what government is doing. But we are just kicking an own goal at the moment, which will have an absolutely devastating impact. We cannot walk away from that. The Nicholas Moore report actually said, in terms of education as one of the main pillars, that maintaining Australia's position as a destination of choice will require competitive policy settings. We are now trashing those competitive policy settings by having visas, which are now the highest fees at $1,600 from $700, from putting potentially caps on across the market. the messaging into the market is really damaging. So I sound like a broken record, but it is really the single biggest issue that is facing our university sector and the economy at this point in time. To end on a positive note from my perspective, I do think things like outward bound student mobility and inward bound student mobility is important. I think having bricks and mortar on the ground where we can, we've got it in Suzhou, we've got it in Malaysia, as I said, we've got it in Indonesia, in India, etc. Trying to navigate the regulatory barriers in those countries for each of those universities is really challenging, but we keep at it. And so I think, universities are nothing if not eternally optimistic, actually, because we do good things. It's just, let's not kick the own goal to such an extent that, we've got a big hill to climb coming out of it.
We're running out of time, so maybe it's a big question, but maybe some short answers. But I mean, we're all really hostage to geopolitics here, aren't we? I mean, especially Amanda's right in the middle of it with your industry, China-US rivalry, the threat of a conflict in Asia. I mean, how do you balance all that up when you're making these business decisions?
Yes, that is a very large question, Mike. We're just a little company, really, yet we have the attention of governments all around the world. In any given quarter, we are likely to have visitors to our plant from the EU, from Japan, from Australia, from China, from the US at any given time. We actually are not politicians, and it is not our job to be politicians. However, I think that what we have is, across the world, we have an understanding of the importance of secure and resilient supply chains, and anytime you have a singular supply chain, it is not going to be resilient. And so we really focus on what we can bring to industry development rather than how do we play being either on one side or the other. In Malaysia in particular, I think our current Prime Minister has played a very good game in terms of walking the line between engagement with China and friendship and engagement with the US. And so we see that as providing a really, providing a unique opportunity. And if Malaysia is able to bank that, we think it will be good for Malaysia and it will be good for us.
Yeah, Peter, how do we manage this? James Curran called it the risks of rivalry before. Obviously for the Australian, it's Myanmar's probably off limits, but everywhere else in Southeast Asia's open. But how do you juggle those competing relationships?
I think commercially it's probably less of an issue than you might think it is, because it's an interesting one to speak about politically. But in terms of actually doing trade deals or investment deals across the region, it's not going to be part of your landscape. Yeah. And so for the countries we're talking about, and say Myanmar for the minute is not part of that, that I actually don't think you should consider that to be a detriment. Now, you need to be aware, you need to be thoughtful, but I don't think it's the hurdle that it could be presented as. Just one final comment I wanted to make. As we're engaging across the broader region, one thing for sure is that the response in market is a very welcoming one, and the hand is being reached out to us in return. So I think what we find is the more that we reach out, the more that those in market are reaching out in return. Yeah. And so ultimately, I think there's a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. And if you're not doing it now, you need to think ahead 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, because that economic gravity is inevitable. And so how are you going to get there then if you're not acting on it now?
We're going to, unless you want to chip in, we're going to open it up to questions. Any questions from the floor? This gentleman up here at the back.
Thank you.
Because we lost our questions.
Thank you. Thank the panel for all their comments. I just have one question to ask, and that is, coming back to the central question of this session, it seems to me that we have not answered the question of the session itself, which is Australia punching below its weight in Asia. I'm hearing the experiences and stories here that I might be tempted to believe that the answer is a resounding yes. However, from Peter's figures, and I admit that I don't know the, shall we say, statistical semantics of those numbers, but Australia, 3.4%, I think, versus 7% globally, outward investment into Asia. So I just am wondering to myself, summarily, is Australia punching below its weight in Asia? And if it is not, why? And what could we possibly do about it? Thank you.
Do you want me to try first?
Have another go. We
Yeah.
did touch on that before. Have a
Qualified
go.
yes. A qualified yes. We are not punching above our weight at the moment. There are some areas of success, and we've maybe dwelled more on the negatives than the positives, but on balance, we could and should be doing more. Is that?
I think everyone agrees here, except maybe
No, I
Vicky.
think we are punching above our weight in the
Yeah.
international education context. Just, it's at risk.
Okay. We'll take one more question.
No, we're giving.
Oh no, we're out of
up.
time. We're out of time. Thanks very
That's
much to our
what the red numbers mean.
Amanda wants to keep going because the last session went over time. She was very annoyed. Thanks very much. It was a great discussion.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks.